In June, my boyfriend, our dog, and I were camping in Asheville, North Carolina, right by the Appalachian Trail and a river where we'd been kayaking. We'd finished kayaking for the day and were unwinding at our campsite before dinner. Our tent was just 10 feet from the trail, with the river right behind us. The day had been pretty frantic and stressful on the water, so we really needed to relax. Since our supply of cannabis flower was low, we'd eaten some edibles. Because we're stoners, my boyfriend was half asleep in his hammock, and I was stretched out on a towel near the river's edge, when a man approached us, rambling about giving us his trash. Initially I was confused, but then I noticed his backpack, an Appalachian Trail shirt. I quickly understood he was a serious hiker on the trail and wanted us to carry his garbage, which is usually a reasonable request. However, the dumpster and basic services were literally only a 5-minute walk down the trail. I pointed this out, thinking he'd rather dispose of it himself if it was so close. But then he pulled out a big bag of cannabis and offered me some if I took his trash. It was a strange offer, but I'd never say no to free weed, so I just shrugged and said, "Sure, we'll toss it for you." He handed me a small bunch of nugs and dropped his trash into our bag. I asked him a few casual questions, like if he was through hiking, and he said he had been for a few months. Then he asked if he could stay and have a beer. I figured, why not? He seemed normal enough and appeared to just need some company, and I wasn't busy. I did suspect he might have approached because he thought I was alone, not having noticed the hammock. I figured the worst that could happen was he'd be slightly let down that he couldn't flirt with me or something. At some point, my boyfriend poked his head out, and the hiker looked genuinely surprised to see him, which confirmed my suspicion. He kept saying things like, "Oh, don't worry, I'm not one of those weird guys." I just thought, okay, buddy, I hope not. I tried to be friendly, asking simple questions about his trail adventures, and he answered normally enough. My boyfriend and I decided to smoke some of our own weed by the river, and of course offered some to the hiker, since he had given us. He took a hit and coughed a lot, and that's when things started to get really weird. As experienced cannabis users, we'd seen people get too high and act a bit strange, but this guy was on another level. He talked and talked, but his voice was so quiet we could barely hear a word he said. I tried to look interested and reply, but I had no idea what he was talking about. He just stared at the river, murmuring to himself, occasionally glancing at us, as if we were part of his private conversation, and I'd just awkwardly nod or say, "Oh, right." It was truly unsettling and confusing. He also drank at least 3 beers and smoked 2 cigarettes during this time, so it wasn't a quick visit. This man just wouldn't leave. When we stopped responding, he started talking to Siri on his phone, actually yelling at her and calling her names at one point. Then, completely out of the blue, he asked, "On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do I seem like a serial killer?" My boyfriend and I exchanged a look. We'd both had the exact same thought. This guy had just crossed a serious line into creepy territory. We both let out nervous laughs and quickly said, "Oh, a 1. Definitely not at all." We tried to act casual, as if it were a joke, but inside we were both screaming, "What the heck?" After that, I firmly decided he wasn't welcome. My boyfriend and I both moved to the hammock, sitting together and mostly ignoring him. He muttered that he'd smoke 1 more cigarette and then leave. I swear that was the longest cigarette I have ever seen in my life. It took him ages to finish it, and I just watched it get shorter and shorter, desperate for him to go. He finally stood up, gathered his things, and left. But it was almost dark, so we knew he wouldn't go far before setting up his own camp for the night. All that night, we were convinced he would return and kill us. Other people did walk by on the trail multiple times, but they were folks we'd seen earlier in the day, including a couple who seemed to be on drugs and might have lived further up the trail. We literally planned our escape, grab the dog, jump into the river, and float downstream to the boat ramp. Thankfully, he never showed up that night, and we never saw him again, but the experience was enough to totally freak us out. Maybe he just had poor social skills and had been alone in the woods too long. Or maybe, just maybe, something truly sinister was at play, and I'm incredibly grateful I wasn't alone when he approached. I grew up in southern Appalachia, in western North Carolina, just 30 minutes outside Asheville. The hills and valleys of these Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest in the world, with some rock formations dating back over 1 billion years. This means they were here before any land animals roamed the earth. Like most things that have existed for eons, these mountains hold inexplicable mysteries, both gentle and unsettling. Take the Brown Mountain Lights, for instance. I've never felt threatened or uneasy watching them from Wiseman's View. They simply exist, neither good nor evil. On the gentler side, sometimes you walk through an abandoned old church near my parents' property, and you can feel a warm, happy energy, like that perfect first warm day of summer. Not too hot, not too cold. But this story isn't about those kinds of wonder. This is about something distinctly menacing. About 10 years ago, I was attending night school at AbTech, studying automotive mechanics. I'd go to class around 2 p.m. after my part-time job, and usually get home by 10:30 p.m., depending on traffic. Every night, I drove the same road in my trusty old 1973 Dodge pickup, Old Betsy. Some nights it got boring, so I'd take a different route, cutting off I-40 onto the back roads. But on this particular evening, I just stayed on. It was a Thursday, no class Friday, and all I wanted was to get home, get to bed early, and be ready to hike in the woods at sunrise the next day. As I exited I-40 onto the ramp leading to my parents' home, the night seemed to grow intensely dark. All the usual animal sounds I could hear through my rolled-down windows fell silent. I've never been an anxious person in my life, but in that moment, something felt profoundly wrong, and I couldn't pinpoint why. I stopped at the end of the exit ramp, turned onto the road, and noticed the 24-hour gas station that served as a truck stop near my parents' place had no lights on. It was always brightly lit. I brushed it off, thinking it was a power outage, but I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was truly off. I slowly shifted through the gears of my old truck, trying to make as little noise as possible. I leaned over the steering wheel to look at the moon through the windshield. There were hardly any stars visible, which was highly unusual. If you've ever been to Appalachia, especially the less populated areas like where I'm from, you know you can see the Milky Way on clear nights. The absence of stars back home only happens with heavy cloud cover, or well, whatever the heck happened that night. As I rounded a particularly sharp left turn and chugged down a straight stretch before the next right-hander, my gaze fell on an ancient, crumbling barn I always looked at. I thought about how long it had stood there, how many changes it had witnessed. For a fleeting second, my eyes wandered, and that's when a very large, sickly-looking dog darted out in front of my truck, no more than 10 feet away. Old Betsy was a great truck, but her brakes weren't the best. I heard the fence post I kept in the bed bounce out, and then back in as I skidded to a stop. My first thought was, oh no, now I have to tell the neighbors I hit their dog. Around here, that's a serious matter. It can really anger people, depending on the dog and the owner. As I sat there, breathing in the smell of burning rubber, something else reached my nose. The stench of rotting flesh. It's a smell you never forget once you've encountered it. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Just figured it was some roadkill near. Finally, I told myself, let me go check and see whose dog this is. I pushed in the clutch, shifted into reverse, and as I glanced at my rearview mirror, illuminated by the eerie glow of my reverse lights, there was the same dog, except it wasn't on 4 legs anymore. It had stood up like a man easily over 10 feet tall. Only then did it strike me that the front of my truck was a good 5 feet tall, and this dog had been 5 feet tall at the shoulder when it was on all 4. As it turned its head to look in the direction of my truck, I caught only a quick glimpse of this thing. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't a man. It was something in between and yet entirely separate. Its skin hung loosely from its bony, thin frame, like a raccoon. Bits of matted fur, dirt and mud clung to its legs, looking like a disease. The right arm seemed a little longer than the left, and both hung abnormally low for either an animal or a human. As this creature regained its senses, it turned and looked directly into my mirror, as if it knew exactly where I was sitting. Its face was vaguely man-like, but the very edges of it seemed undefined, moving and shifting like something you'd see under a microscope in a science documentary. There were no eyes, only empty sockets, where eyes should have been. No hair, and the skin, which seemed to be dripping from its face, was a cold, lifeless gray. Its nose was short and pressed into its face, like a bulldog's, but its teeth still haunt me. They were clearly carnivorous, and true to the rest of its unnatural appearance. Many weren't arranged normally in its mouth. They seemed to fill and spill forth from its indistinct face, almost as if they were aware of the space they occupied, and were desperately trying to escape. It stared through me, past my eyes, and deep into my soul. It felt like an eternity, though it couldn't have been more than 5 seconds that I sat there, completely frozen. Then a light flickered on at a nearby house, causing the creature to snap its head in that direction and tear off into the woods on its 2 back legs. Like a man, I slammed my old truck into first gear, spun the tires through first, snatched second gear, and drove home as fast as I could. When I got to the house, both my parents were asleep. I went downstairs to my bedroom, loaded every firearm I owned, and locked all the doors. I couldn't wake them up. I mean, who would ever believe that story at 10:30 on a Thursday night? The basement was eerily quiet that night. Even their dogs, who usually barked at outside animals at all hours, were completely silent. The old post and beam house didn't even creak or pop, which it usually did. Around 3 a.m., I finally started to get drowsy. As I went to lay my head down to try and get some sleep, so I could still hike the next morning, I smelled the stench of death again. It was faint at first, but unmistakably there. I told myself, "You're just going crazy. None of that was real." But as I dwelled on it, the smell became stronger and stronger until it filled the entire basement. My dad has a home office in the basement, with 2 large glass doors that face the national forest. I finally gathered the courage to walk out of my bedroom into the basement living room, carrying my small tactical 12-gauge shotgun with its light on. I covered the flashlight with my hand, so as not to reveal my presence prematurely. As I turned right from the living room into my father's office, I shone the light through the glass doors. At the edge of the woods, there it stood, motionless. It stared directly into the light, unafraid, with those soulless, empty eye sockets. I quickly covered my light, darted back into the living room, and flipped on the outdoor floodlights. To my shock, it was no longer at the edge of the woods, but between the house and the forest, still standing perfectly still. I swung the door open and fired every round I had in its direction. I must have hit it a couple of times, because it let out an unearthly scream, like that of a woman being slaughtered. As it bolted into the woods, the dogs went wild. Mom and Dad woke up, asking what on earth I was doing. I told them a bear had gotten into the trash, and I was scaring it away. They didn't believe me, but I knew they wouldn't believe the truth either. I didn't sleep that night, or any night, until the following Sunday. Everything seemed to return to normal, and I didn't think about the creature again until I met my wife about 6 years later. Her mother's house is at the mouth of a hollow, no more than 4 or 5 miles up the road from my parents'. On the side of the hollow are kennels for her brother's hunting dogs, no longer in use for years, but the fences and concrete pad are still there. They're useful when you need to quarantine an animal. Her Great Pyrenees had gotten into a fight with a raccoon, which of course the dog won, but his rabies vaccination had lapsed, so we had to keep him quarantined for a while. He didn't mind. He rather enjoyed solitude. On this particular night, we were coming home from a movie day in a nearby town, and it was his last night of quarantine. We walked up the trail, using our phone flashlights to reach the kennel. He sat there patiently, tail wagging, happy to see us. We put him on his leash and started walking back to the house. As we walked through the darkness, I started to feel the same unsettling sensation I'd experienced the night I hit the creature with my truck. I didn't say anything, not wanting to alarm my wife, but then the foul smell wafted in on the breeze. She jokingly asked, "My God, what did you eat? You stink." I gave a half-hearted laugh, unable to truly appreciate the joke. because of the terror stirring in my mind. She immediately caught on and asked what was wrong, to which I could only reply, "I'll tell you later." She grew up in the woods and around hunting, so she knew what I meant. She knew we were being watched. When we could see the lights of the house from the trail, we heard it bark coming from the kennel. It sounded exactly like the Great Pyrenees we had on a leash next to us. It was a perfect imitation. Our Pyrenees, being a guardian dog, instantly sensed something was wrong. He turned to face the danger, letting out deep barks and growls in that direction. I don't know if you've ever had to drag a 150-pound dog, but it's incredibly hard work. I'm 6 feet tall and 240 pounds, and it took everything I had to pull him back to the house. The barking never stopped the entire time we were running towards the house. In fact, it seemed to get closer and closer, until it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. Her mother heard the commotion and flipped on the floodlights just as we reached the yard fence. I caught a glimpse of something. It came to a dead stop, right where the light ended, spun around and tore off back into the darkness. My wife looked at me and asked, "Do you want to tell me what the hell that was?" To which I replied, "Yes. Let's just go inside." I told her the entire story, and she listened intently, hanging on every word. Her family came from a long line of granny witches and other Appalachian supernatural healers, so her older sister came over the next morning with some herbs and chants to bless the property and ward off evil. I suggested we go up to the dog kennels and bless them too. When we reached the kennels, they were completely destroyed. The concrete foundation was cracked, the chain link fence torn from its posts, dog houses smashed, and the whole place reeked of the creature's stench. My wife's older sister went about her business calmly, blessed the area, burned some herbs, and led us back to the house. Once inside, she turned to us suddenly and firmly instructed, "Never go into the woods after dark, not until this thing leaves you alone." To make a long story short, my wife joined the military and was stationed in Delaware. As someone who'd lived around large mountains and endless wilderness my entire life, I found Delaware pretty terrible at first, especially when we initially moved into a city with over 50. Fortunately, it didn't take us long to find a house in a quiet little community further south. We bought the house and moved in quickly, both grateful to be out of the city and back in a rural set. The land in Delaware feels lifeless compared to Appalachia. The sparse woods don't hold any particular energy, good or bad. The ground doesn't feel alive like it does in Appalachia. Having not thought about the creature in a long time, I started staying outside after dark again, playing with our dogs in our rather large yard that borders a small patch of woods. Well, last night, I went outside to play with the dog. As darkness settled, I built a good-sized fire in my fire pit and enjoyed some old-fashioned Appalachian moonshine from a mason jar. Just as the fire was dying down, my American bulldog suddenly darted towards the wood. He has a habit of running off for adventures, so my first instinct was to chase him across the yard and tackle him to stop him from getting away. As I wrestled his 110-pound body to the ground and hoisted him into a fireman's carry over my shoulders, I heard him bark. Only the bark wasn't coming from him. The only sound from my dog was a deep rumbling growl, a noise I'd never really heard him make before. It was a threatening sound. Something was definitely wrong. As I ran with him on my shoulders back to the house, the stench of death again began to fill the air. Our two other dogs must have sensed what was happening and met me at the back door, which I threw open, slammed shut, locked, and then immediately reloaded my firearm. How the hell could this thing have followed us 650 miles up here? As I flipped on the floodlights at the back of my house, several bushes and small trees at the forest's edge were still shaking as if something had just torn through them. My dogs went wild all night, barking and howling, and trying to get out the windows. I didn't sleep a wink, and I don't think I will for a long time. I know for sure I won't be in the woods after dark ever again in my life. Not until this thing is gone. I'm originally from West Virginia, but as a kid between the ages of 10 and 13, I moved back and forth between Appalachia and the Midwest. For a few years I lived in rural Kentucky, in the foothills of one of the planet's oldest mountain ranges. I stayed with my dad and grandparents. We lived in a kind of cul-de-sac, nestled between two foothills, in the middle of our small neighborhood, with only family on either side. No one lived directly across from us,
or behind us, because of the steep hills. When I first moved in, my grandma had some rules I had to follow. At the time, I just thought they were typical hillbilly stranger danger warnings. They started with things like, don't mess with the wild animals, and don't go into the woods alone. Then they got a little strange. If you hear your name, don't answer and don't go towards. And the weirdest one, if you see someone in the woods you might know, you didn't, just come straight home. This particular experience happened in August. When I was 11, my dad and I had mowed a path through the tall grass and berry bushes to the left of our double-wide trail. We often camped out there because it was close enough to check on Grandma. In the woods, sounds are louder than you think. The calls of animals, the buzzing of insects, the wind rustling through the trees and grass. A stream ran along the road, easily heard. That night we added the crackle of a campfire to the symphony. My dad decided to go back up to the house, about a quarter-mile away, to grab more beer and check on Grandma. Before he left, he told me not to mess with the fire. After a few minutes of watching the flames, things started to get quiet. Really quiet. The wind died down. All insect and animal sounds vanished, and the stream sounded like it was miles away. I began to feel uneasy, even though I'd been left alone at the campsite before. Then I started to smell and taste it. An awful metallic tang in the back of my throat. Out of nowhere. After a few more moments of dread, my dad returned. He was immediately angry, saying he could smell burning metal coming up the trail. He accused me of tossing beer cans into the fire. I told him I hadn't, and even pointed to the untouched cans to prove it. He then said a storm was coming in, and we needed to get back home, and he let the accusation drop. We packed up the tent and headed back. The thing about lightning in the woods, which is both cool and strange, is how it lights up everything like the middle of the day. But past the first line of trees, it's absolute pitch black. There are no street lights, and unless you have lights on your property, it's completely dark. So it was pitch black, lightly raining, and aside from the dim lights through the house windows, there was nothing. I was eating watermelon, as one does in August, in the mountains, when the first clap of lightning struck. Everything was as bright as could be. After the flash passed, it was pitch black again. The next clap of lightning came, and that's when I think I saw it. On the porch past the yard, over the stream, past the road and the ditches on either side, just beyond the first line of trees, I could see its silhouette. Then it went dark. This was also when I could taste the same awful burning metal again. I wasn't really sure what I saw, so I just froze. A few moments later, the lightning hit again. The figure was now closer, standing right beside the tree. I stood there unsure what to do, not wanting to see it again, or for it to get any closer. I ran inside. My grandma was doing dishes, and asked why I was inside. I told her I thought I saw something. She almost immediately got my dad on his feet, telling him to shut and lock all the windows and doors. My vaguely drunk dad obeyed. That night, I slept with her. The next day we found the tent doors ripped off. It didn't look like an animal had done it. Nothing was cut or shredded, but rather looked like someone had taken and pulled the fabric apart. My uncle, who lived a mile or so up the road, had all 8 of his chickens killed, their heads gone, but with no blood. For the next few weeks, all the kids had to wait for the bus with an adult. My dad had to be late for work for almost 3 weeks. Anytime I tried to talk about it, the subject was just changed. I figured I was just a kid, and it wasn't important, but it wasn't until years later that I finally understood. I was in my early 20s, and some cousins were in town for Halloween. As I was telling this story, my aunt became furious with me, saying, "Don't you tell them that. Don't you put that evil on them." After that, I couldn't help but think back on all the times I'd tried to talk about it, and how I'd been dismissed. My child's mind hadn't realized it wasn't just a simple change of subject, but rather active silence. Once I started exploring Reddit, I realized there was a name for this thing. The same name my aunt had called it that day at the party, the goat. What bothers me the most is how to this day, I couldn't describe any specific feature of it, nor have I ever again tasted that awful burning metallic flavor. So my friends, if you ever find yourself in the foothills of Kentucky, please remember my grandma's rule. I once had a dear friend who loved hiking. We'll call her Annie to protect her privacy. She spent most of her free time on trails in and around the Appalachian region, across Tennessee and North Carolina, no matter the season. One summer she decided to spend a few weeks hiking the Appalachian Trail. She wasn't planning the entire trek, just starting at Springer Mountain in Georgia and finishing at Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. I was all for it and encouraged her, even helping her pack. We arranged to meet where the trail passed through the Newfound Gap area in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I would bring her fresh supplies and hike with her for a few days while she was in the park, close to where I lived at the time. The day came for her journey to begin, and I drove her to the trailhead, dropping off a very excited and determined Annie. During the first few weeks, I received several postcards from her. She'd stop at resupply points to pick up her prearranged packages of food and gear, and she'd write as often as she could to assure me she was safe and making good time. Eventually July rolled around and our meeting date approached. Before she left, we had carefully planned when she would reach our designated backcountry shelter, settling on July 10th. She was supposed to send a postcard from her last resupply spot before our meet. True to form, I received one on July 2nd, detailing that she felt great and was on schedule to meet me at Mount LeConte Shelter on July 7th. We planned to stay at the lodge for the evening, have dinner and rest before continuing the trip. Mount LeConte Lodge was a popular destination, requiring reservations months in advance for a single night's shelter. It was crucial to stick to our schedule, and Annie knew this well.
I gathered all the necessary supplies, and my then boyfriend drove me to the trailhead. He was going to hike with me to the shelter and leave once I met up with Annie. We had a wonderful hike, enjoying the breathtaking views of the Smokies, even as we panted and sweated up the steep climbs. Eventually we reached the shelter, and I fully expected Annie to be there waiting. It was mid-afternoon, and we were only an hour or two behind schedule. We checked with the front desk to see if she had arrived, only to find out she hadn't. We didn't worry too much. With backcountry hiking, you can never be entirely sure of arrival times. So we took our gear and settled into our bunk. We went up to the lodge, had some coffee, and leisurely enjoyed our books and the views. While waiting for Annie, sunset came, and she still hadn't appeared. This is when genuine worry started to set in. My boyfriend and I walked back to the office and asked if anyone named Annie had tried to check in. To our dismay, no one had. We returned to our shelter, and my boyfriend tried to calm my rising anxiety. "She's probably running behind," he assured me. The trails in this area of the park reach the highest elevations of the entire Appalachian. She probably got tired and fell behind schedule. If she doesn't get here tonight, she'll probably make it by tomorrow. Don't worry. I tried to let his words soothe me as we lay down to rest, but I endured a long, sleepless night. She didn't show up the next day. We waited at the office for hours, but she never arrived. Around 2 p.m., we decided to hike down the trail in the direction she was expected to come from. We told the lady at the office to tell Annie we would be back if she arrived while we were gone. We made it back to the lodge around 5 p.m. and found out she still hadn't appeared. From this point, things became chaotic. I won't go into much detail, but we had no choice but to leave the lodge and return home, leaving our contact information with the staff to let us know if she ever arrived. Days passed, and there was no sign of her. Anxiety, guilt, and fear consumed me in the days that followed. We contacted the police, and massive search parties were sent out. Rangers, police, and volunteers scoured the area between where she was last seen and where she was supposed to arrive. It wasn't until almost a week and a half later that they found her, bruised and starving, hiding in a ravine about 30 miles away from the Appalachian Trail and the last shelter she'd stayed at. Just over a day later, I was finally allowed to see her at the hospital. She hadn't told the police anything about what happened. In fact, she hadn't spoken at all. It took her a few years to fully tell me what had occurred, including the details she wouldn't share with the authorities. The experience made her quit hiking altogether. I'm not sure if she'd want me sharing this with you all, but I want people to be aware that this danger exists, and it's something to look out for when hiking the Smokies. And it's probably not the only place this can happen. I will tell you exactly as I remember it, In her words, as best I can. I left the shelter around 8 hours in the morning on June 31st and hiked most of the day, making really good time. I was resting and eating some snacks, getting that last burst of energy I needed to reach my campsite for the night. It was late afternoon when I first heard it. Men's voices. They seemed pretty far off, but I figured it was just some other hikers. Nothing out of the ordinary. I sat there for another 15 minutes, but no one ever walked by. The voices would come and go. It was weird, but by this point, I'd been hiking alone for a few weeks, so I just assumed I was imagining things, because I hadn't had much regular human contact. I grabbed my things and continued on my way, reaching my campsite just as the sun vanished and light was fading. I set up my tent and strung my belongings up on the wire cables to keep them safe from bears and other animals if they decided to wander by. I was relaxing in my sleeping bag, reading a book, when I heard it again. Voices, louder now than before. I could faintly make out heavy Appalachian accents, though it was still hard to catch their conversation. I waited for the crunch of leaves or the snap of twigs to signal other hikers joining my sight, but the sound never came. I closed my eyes and forced myself to sleep. You're just hearing things, I told myself. The next morning greeted me with the gentle sounds of birds chirping and a soft breeze humming through the trees and against my tent. I went outside and, to my dismay, found some wrappers from my freeze-dried food scattered across the ground. They looked as if they'd been torn open, and all the food was gone. It was only a couple of packs, so I still had a decent supply. I thought squirrels must have found a way into my backpack. The only strange part was that my backpack was zipped shut and showed no signs of the nibbling or scratches an animal would typically leave. I packed up my campsite uneasily, trying not to connect it with the voices I'd heard the night before. I walked faster that day, trying to keep a quicker pace, hoping to leave the weird voices and strange happenings behind me. I'd been hiking for a few hours, passing very few people, when I heard the voices again. They didn't go away this time. They seemed to stay at a steady distance behind me. No matter how many times I looked over my shoulder, I never saw anyone. I came upon my next planned campsite and made an immediate decision. I would hike through the night. If these people following me were dangerous, I didn't want to set up camp and leave myself vulnerable to an attack. I walked slowly through the night, using my flashlight as a guide. The voices had stopped a couple of hours ago, and I was starting to feel like I had lost them, whoever they were. I came to a small clearing on the trail and decided I would rest for a few hours, because my feet felt like they were on fire from all the walking I'd done. I hadn't even taken the tent from my backpack when I heard the voices again, this time directly behind me. There she is, a deep voice boomed in my ears. I spun around, pointing my flashlight into the eyes of two men. They were ragged, dirty, and unshaven. The look in their eyes was sinister, and I will never forget the way my skin crawled beneath their gaze. I screamed and took off running in the direction I had come from. I could hear their bare feet pounding along the trail behind me as I ran. When I was far enough away and over a hill, I cut off the trail and sprinted as fast as I could through the brush and trees. It was starting to get light at this point, so I could move easier than if it were still pitch black. For the next 2 weeks, I hid in the woods, dodging their haunting voices and concealing myself in bushes. They were never far. Sometimes I would see them wandering around, talking about the things they wanted to do to me. They looked as if they hadn't bathed in months, and both wore only torn cargo shorts. Their hair was long, and their bodies were covered in mud. I knew no one would be looking for me for at least another week, as I wasn't expected until July 7th. I barely survived, struggling to find water and rationing my food carefully. I knew if they found me they would do terrible things to me. I felt it in their eyes. I felt it when I looked at their clenched fists, and I heard it in their raspy voices. Eventually, a park ranger and a group of volunteers found me. A few weeks after being home and out of the hospital, I did some research and found out there were people who hid in the mountains to escape the law, living there to avoid jail for the crimes they had committed. There were people who had murdered and harmed others in ways that would have warranted life in prison or even death. They are called the wild men. After hearing her story, I haven't gone hiking much. They can't possibly be the only ones out there.
If you go hiking deep in the mountains, be sure to watch your back, because the wild men are always lurking. To start, I need to give some background. I'm 23 and currently live in New York City, but my grandparents live in the absolute middle of nowhere, in West Virginia. When I say middle of nowhere, I mean the literal boonies. Their closest neighbors are over an hour away, in a small town with just a few houses and a Walmart. Last summer, my grandfather, who I'll call Robert for privacy, had hip surgery. Most of my family lives on the West Coast, and my grandmother, Muriel, is very old and wouldn't have been able to care for Robert alone. Since I was the closest family member, they asked me to come down for 2 weeks to help him recover. Being a good grandson, I agreed. Fast forward a week, and everything was going fine. All I really had to do was help my grandfather up and down the stairs and walk his dog, a blue heeler named Rocky. Normally, my grandfather would walk Rocky once in the morning and once at night through the woods behind their property. But because of his surgery, that job fell to me. This was the part of helping that I hated. Ever since I was a kid, I never liked those woods behind the house. Whenever my cousins and I went down there, we always got creeped out by that forest. It just always felt off for some reason. Anyway, for the first week, walking Rocky in the forest at night was fine, if a bit spooky. That changed one night, about a week into my stay. I was walking him through the woods around 8:30 p.m. as the sun was setting over the Appalachian Mountains. Everything was normal until I heard a strange whistle, sounding only about 20 yards away. Both Rocky and I stopped dead in our tracks and looked towards where the whistling came from. I shone my flashlight in that direction but saw nothing, so I just assumed it was a bird. Looking back, it definitely wasn't a bird. There are no nocturnal birds out there that chirp and whistle like that, and it sounded more musical than anything a bird could produce. But Rocky was truly spooked. He wouldn't stop growling and staring at whatever was back there, constantly trying to back away, until the thing, whatever or whoever it was, whistled again. That's when Rocky started barking and going absolutely crazy. At this point, I decided I absolutely did not want to stay there. I yanked on Rocky's leash, and we both bolted out of the woods and ran straight back home. When we got back, I told my grandparents what had happened. They both looked visibly frightened. My grandmother immediately asked if I had whistled. I told her I hadn't, and she seemed relieved. But then she told me that I hadn't heard anything and should just ignore it. I asked why, but she wouldn't tell me, only repeating that I hadn't heard anything. I decided not to push it further and went to bed, terrified, wondering what had scared her so much. The next morning, she told me that instead of walking Rocky through the woods, I could just take him for a few laps around the house. So that's what I started doing every night, about 50 laps around the house before going back inside. On Friday, my third to last day there, I was walking Rocky for his evening laps, as usual, until I heard that same creepy whistle again. This time it came from behind the attached garage, only about 10 yards from the house. I immediately brought Rocky inside and locked the doors. For the rest of the night, I put in my earbuds and ignored any further whistling, just as my grandmother had told me to. To this day, I still don't know what was whistling in those woods. Some of my friends suggested it was a skinwalker, but that's not really a local legend here. My girlfriend, who stayed back in New York City, asked her Muslim parents, who are from Yemen, and they said whistling at night is a sign that a jinn is nearby. I don't know what it was, but whatever it was had my grandparents genuinely terrified. I've heard of strange things happening in Appalachia, but this was my first personal experience with it. Does anyone have any idea what this could have been? If you ever find yourself in the mountains after sundown, be careful, be respectful, and most importantly, don't touch the skull. The first time someone told me that, I thought they were just strange, superstitious people. I had just moved to a small town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, looking for a new start away from the busy cities I'd lived in my whole life. A house with a forest as its backyard, and neighbors a mile or so away, sounded perfect at the time. It's what made me buy the property. Don't get me wrong, the house is nice. It has a few issues, like a creaking porch and a kitchen that's a bit too small for my liking. But it's cute. Quaint, the realtor kept saying when she showed me the rooms, and I agreed. Even if it was a little small, the real selling point was the acres of forest that would be considered mine. I remember my first trip to the town at the mountain's base, a tiny place where everyone knew everyone. Naturally, some were unsure about me, but most were actually kind, asking where I grew up, what I did for work. Normal questions. The owner of the only grocery store in town, Mr. Faraday, asked me if I planned on hiking in the forest. Well, yes, of course. I think I laughed as he bagged my groceries, eyeing me the entire time. Of course, silly question. He agreed as he handed me the bags, then continued. The forest is perfectly safe during the day. Just get home once the sun starts setting. You're asking for trouble with the wildlife, or you'll get lost if it gets too dark. Anything in particular I should worry about? I asked. I mean, we get black bears sometimes. All you have to do is yell at them though, and they'll usually run. Scaredy cats, the lot of them. Unless you find a mama. Moose, foxes, wild boars, and even wolves. I paused, gathering my bags, and repeated, wolves. I thought wolves were extinct here in the Appalachians. Mr. Faraday shrugged, ignoring my question, and went on as if I hadn't spoken. Anything. Be careful out there. Always take water. Be respectful. Don't be one of them city folk that make a mess of the place. See a flower and think it's pretty. You take a picture and leave it alone. Easy enough. Anything else I should do? I wanted to be polite, and not just dismiss the guy, even if most of his advice was common sense. Then again, I didn't doubt there had been trouble in the past with outsiders. It happened all the time in the parks I visited as a kid, where rude people would leave beer cans or cigarette butts everywhere. He met my eyes, staring for a second too long, before he replied, if you see skulls or bones, don't touch them. If they are in the way, you go around them. I stared back, feeling uneasy as he suddenly smiled and said, you come back soon here. I run specials every week on fresh produce and meat. I really should have listened to him better. The first few times I ventured into the forest, it was always in the late morning. There's an old trail behind the house, overgrown but still usable. There are all kinds of songbirds, small animals, and interesting plant life to see. I tried going in the morning when it wasn't too hot, always making sure to bring water and wear good hiking boots whenever I had time for a walk. Before work, there was a point on the trail where it branched off in two directions, and that's where I would always turn back. The last thing I wanted was to choose the wrong path and end up hopelessly lost, or unable to find my way back. Then my work schedule changed, so I started going in the late afternoon. I stayed out longer, finishing my hike just as the sky was painted in pinks and oranges, the sun no longer visible, but giving just enough light. I never noticed anything different between the morning and late afternoon hikes, other than fewer birds singing. Then small things began to happen. Little oddities that were easy to dismiss. Trees with long scratches down their trunks, or the songbirds quieting down at the start of my afternoon hikes, rather than towards the end. I figured it was from the seasons changing, nights getting longer and days shortening. I had to be quick about my daily routine, only letting myself go maybe a mile into the forest before turning around. Even if I didn't entirely believe the townspeople, who had become more vocal about being mindful in the woods, I still didn't want to get lost. Then I came across a deer skull. It was right in the middle of the path back to my house, bleached white and cracked, looking far too old. I glanced around the trees to see if anyone was around, because it hadn't been there on my way up the mountain. I even called out a nervous hello, and got no response. The idea of leaving it where I constantly walked made me uneasy, so I grabbed a stick and carefully put it through one of the eye sockets. I took a breath, then tossed it off into the trees, watching it hit the ground before dropping the stick and quickly making my way back home. That's when the howling started. It woke me up in the dead of night, a long, lone howl off in the distance. I was confused, startled, because until that point, I had never heard a wolf howl before outside of TV. I didn't even know if that's what it was. I lay there for a while listening to it, then turned on some music to drown it out and go back to sleep. For a week I would wake up in a cold sweat to the wolf singing away, until I finally started going to sleep with music on. I asked about it the next time I went into town, curious if anyone else had heard it, but nobody had. Mr. Faraday shook his head and said he hadn't heard any noise as he gave me change for my grocery. The pharmacist told me it was probably just a lonely or hurt animal when I was looking for some sleep aid. Even the waitress at the diner shrugged and said, haven't heard a thing, honey. Just make sure to keep your doors locked. Always better to be safe than sorry. The next time I went into the forest, I made sure it was right after work, so I could enjoy a nice long stroll. The trees with the scratches were closer to my home now, but I shrugged it off, thinking it was a bear. I did my usual circuit, followed the trail until it branched off, and took a minor break, sitting on a fallen tree to drink some water. As I got up to start my way down, I noticed the forest had become quiet. I felt nervous, glancing around for a reason, like a bear stalking nearby, but found nothing. At that point I quickly headed back home and nearly tripped over another skull, a moose skull, judging by the huge antlers, still attached to the white bone, perfectly preserved and staring in my direction. I looked around, wanting to find out who was messing with me, but I couldn't see anything but trees and ferns. I thought about picking it up and throwing it aside, but I took a deep breath and walked around it. Then I began running back home. It appeared 2 more times before I had enough. On the 3rd time, I picked it up and threw it into the trees. I didn't stay to watch where it landed. The moment I got home, I slammed the door and locked everything. I was shaking, trembling in my kitchen after locking the back door, and dared to look out the window. I didn't see anything, but I felt like something was watching me. The howling didn't wake me up that night. No, the sound of my porch creaking did. The groaning of wood had my eyes snapping open as my heart leaped into my throat. I lay in bed, unable to move, when I heard a low growl near my window. The curtain was drawn tight, so I couldn't see outside, but I could hear whatever it was. The sound was definitely animalistic, but something about it didn't sound quite right. I tried to put my finger on it when the growling stopped for a second. Then a howl rattled my windows, in my very bones. I rushed to my bathroom, the only place in the house with no windows, and slammed the door shut, curling up in the bathtub. I didn't move until my alarm rang at 7 and the sun was shining through the curtains. It kept happening every night. The porch would creak, the growling would begin, then finally the howls that lasted until the sun came up. I had enough by the 4th or 5th night, and drove back to town, fueled by a cocktail of adrenaline, fear and caffeine. I had to wait for the store to open, but the moment it did, I sought out Mr. Faraday, who was stocking some items on the shelf. He glanced at me, then said, "You look like hell. If you need help sleeping, you should see the doctor. Something keeps showing up at my house. I think it's that wolf I was telling you about," I stammered. He froze, a slight tremor in his fingers, before he turned. "Sarah, mind the front. I'll be back." He didn't wait for a reply, and instead headed to the back of the store, motioning for me to come along. I followed him through a door that led outside. Once out in the too sunny morning, he lit a cigarette, then sighed. "I told you to mind the bone." I broke down at that point, lack of sleep leaving me without a filter. It kept showing up. I ignored it the first time, and it kept getting in my way. What was it? A moose skull. There was another skull 2 weeks ago. It was a deer, but I moved that with a stick. He shook his head. "Still counts, son. What happened after you moved the deer?" I admitted, that's when the howling first started, but it was far off in the distance, easy to ignore, something that made him frown, but he didn't interrupt until I finally asked, "It's not a wolf, is it?" Mr. Faraday looked at me for a long time, then stomped out the cigarette, before reaching for another. "I told you what not to do, and yet you did it. Now you've got a mess to deal with." I opened my mouth, ready to demand he answer my question, but he kept going. "Now listen here, and you listen good. You're going to buy some meat, the reddest, bloodiest meat I have. Then go home and put them in the fridge. When the sun is setting, you're going to go in that forest, with the meat, and put it on the path. The minute you do that, you turn tail and run home. You don't look back, no matter what sounds you hear or feelings you get. You run and lock up tight, and it'll just go away." "Just like that?" I asked, feeling a tiny bit hopeful. His next words crushed those hopes. "Nothing is guaranteed, son. This is you trying to make amends. It doesn't mean you'll be forgiven." Anger boiled in me, and I snapped at him. "I didn't even do anything." He shook his head with a small frown and said, "You showed disrespect and acknowledged them. That's enough in a place like this." I opened my mouth, but he brushed past me and asked, "You going to buy the meat or what?" I ended up doing so. I didn't know what else to do, and figured, why not just go along with it? I couldn't explain anything else, so why not try to make amends? I bought the bloodiest steaks I could find, and drove back home in a daze. I set an alarm to ring just before sundown, and crashed on my porch until then. It was surreal, walking out to the trail as the sun began its descent. I noticed that more and more trees had the strange scratches on them, and shuddered at the idea of something, or many somethings, being so close to the house. I walked about 10 minutes up the path before laying out the steak. It was disgusting, the blood pooling on the brown butcher paper, but I piled them up, Then I looked around. I couldn't see anything, just the usual trees, and decided to head back home. I took a handful of steps when I heard it, a low growling from behind me that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Heavy thumping followed the growling, getting closer and closer, breaking me out of my trance. I got my feet moving again, and headed back to the house. The sound of teeth ripping into raw meat met my ears. Once I was at the end of the path, my home in sight, I dared to turn my head before I ran back to the house, scrambling up the porch and barely slamming the door shut in time. It had been right behind me, following like an obedient dog. Only, it wasn't a dog, not even a wolf. I had to brace myself against the door as it slammed into the wood, growling and grunting. I managed to lock it just barely before rushing to the front door to make sure I locked it as well. It nearly beat me. I hit the door just as it started to open, and pushed my entire body weight against it. It seemed like it was barely enough to keep it out as I flicked the lock. I stumbled back, shaking and panting, staring at the door as the growling began all over again. This time, I followed the sound to the back porch, and peered through the window. It walked on 4 legs, fingers spread out with long claws for nails, covered in black fur in some places, and pale human skin in others. As it walked, its back legs bent unnaturally, making a horrific snapping noise, the bones visible through the skin and twisting with every movement. The head was the most disturbing, a bloodied muzzle that stretched out far too much for a wolf, eyes glowing red, and capable of opening its mouth far too wide. The fangs were all black and red with blood, too long, too curved. When it closed its jaws, blood oozed. I stared at it, and it stared at me, before its lips peeled back into a sort of demented smile. The growling stopped, and instead a new sound started. A sharp, high-pitched laugh, almost human, filled the air. I shivered, ready to shut the curtains, when I heard more laughter. I looked beyond it, and saw more pairs of red eyes out in the forest. The heckling grew in volume, echoing until it's all I heard. Even now, I still hear it. I hid in the bathroom again, feeling like a child, and praying that my doors and windows would hold. Once the sun came up and I mustered enough courage to get to my car, I found dozens and dozens of skulls on my porch, all different shapes and sizes, some bleached white, others black with decay, and some even red, lying in pools of blood. One of them was human. I wanted to run to the car, to bulldoze through the bones, but instead I forced myself to carefully step over each and every one of them. Once I got back into town, I sought out Mr. Faraday. He listened quietly to my account, looking disappointed and annoyed by the time I was done. He said, "I told you not to look. Now you really made a mess, not just for you, but for everyone." My blood ran cold, and I asked, "What do you mean, everyone?" "Everybody heard them last night, son, because of your screw-up." He closed his eyes, then lit a cigarette, even though we stood in the paper goods aisle. "What if I just leave? Just go back where I came from?" I asked. He shook his head, then flicked the ashes onto the ground, uncaring of where they landed. "Then what? What do I do?" "You're gonna clean up your own mess. A hunting party is gathering at the diner at sundown. You better be there." I asked if he really thought they could be killed, if it was possible, and he waved his hand. "We've done it before. You're not the first person to not listen. You won't be the last, but you made the trouble. You better be ready to help get rid of it." I swallowed, hesitating, then dared to ask, "Do people not come back from this hunting all the time? This time won't be any different. Sundown, son. Or we'll not just be hunting them, but you too." We are gathered at the diner. I've been given a shotgun and a crash course on how to use it, shown how to load it, and told what not to do, and what to watch out for. According to Mr. Faraday, who was around for the last purge, the Wolves of the Appalachian is what they call them. He's sticking close to me. He says having a buddy nearby is important. It's safer this way. The wolves like to drag people into the forest, or decapitate their victims. They collect the skulls. The bullets I have are supposed to be special, blessed by the priest, and bathed in holy water, or something like that. I've never hunted before. That's why I'm leaving this account, in case I don't come back. Hunting accidents happen all the time. That's what the town folk will say if anyone comes asking about me, or anyone else that doesn't come back. The sun hasn't set yet, giving us time to prepare and the priest time to bless every bullet he can. We can already hear them. The wolves are laughing.